this is Miss Klemme, and welcome to the first of several podcasts on the nervous system. Today, in this video, we're just going to be looking at the components of the central nervous system, starting with the brain and then moving towards the spinal cord. And in this picture you see on the left, it's kind of an artist's rendition of about the proximate regions of the brain where those particular tasks are controlled. And we know some of that, but a lot of it's just an approximation. It's kind of in this area. But the one area that we're pretty sure we know that controls is speech. And speech is just on the left side of the brain. And we know this by looking at stroke victims, or in some cases we can study it with epilepsy patients. So, for example, if I draw some eyeballs here, if I ask you to look at a picture with just your left eye, so I draw a star and I ask you to look at it, and you look at it and it goes down through here, but it's actually interpreted in the back on the right side of your brain. But you can say your left and right sides communicate, and so your speech portion gets that information and says, yes, that's a star. But if I ask you over here, this, if you look in the right eye, it goes through here, gets interpreted, and you say that's a heart. But there are some patients in epilepsy that are so severe, the seizures and the electrical activity between the hemispheres of the brain are so troublesome and causing a lot of suffering that surgeons will actually go in and they'll sever the communication between the left and right halves of the brain. So here's what happens. We show that patient the star, and it goes to the right side of the brain, and you ask that patient what they saw and they can't tell you, but because it didn't go through the speech portion of the brain. But if you show the heart on the right side with the right eye, it goes to the left side of the brain, and they're said, yeah, that's a heart. Now if you ask that patient though to draw a star, for example, draw what you saw, they'll draw this and they'll say, oh yeah, that's a star, because now they're using both eyes and it goes through the left side of the brain. So some really interesting studies have been done with the left and right halves when they're severed. Some odd things can happen. But let's just take a look here at the basic anatomy of the brain. We have the brainstem, cerebellum, diencephalon, and then the largest portion, the portion that's kind of peach colored, is the cerebrum. And that's the one that's most developed in higher vertebrates like ourselves. But let's take a look at the lowest portion and work our way up. The brainstem is composed of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. This is the most primitive portion of our brains, probably because they control very primitive functions, such as breathing and heart rate. But it also acts as kind of a gateway to the rest of the brain, as a relay portion from your spinal cord up to those higher parts of the cerebrum. So there we have the pons, the medulla oblongata, and then the midbrain. And they're from lowest to highest in the brainstem there. Right alongside of the brainstem is the cerebellum. Cerebellum's right under the vision portion of our brain, right about here. What's interesting too, when you actually dissect the brain, the cerebellum is also called the arbor vitae. Spelled that wrong. V-I-T. There we go. It means the tree of life, because when you look at the cerebellum, it actually does look like a tree and all the branches. The cerebellum's job is really to make sure our muscles are all coordinated smoothly. So the bicep and tricep work together to make flexion and extension rather than these jerky, uncoordinated movements. It also plays a little bit of a role in balance and maintaining our posture. Moving up from those two portions of the brain is the diencephalon, which literally means interbrain, between two portions of the brain. And so it really is a great connector from the lower part of the brainstem, up to the larger parts, such as the cerebrum. And there's two components. The hypothalamus is smaller. It controls basically our endocrine system because it controls our pituitary gland, helps to maintain our body temp, and it regulates some pretty basic emotions and our sleep-wake cycles. The thalamus is like a really big switchboard in our brain, and it gets all the incoming sensory information, it sorts it out, and sends it where it needs to go in the cerebrum. It also plays a role in our conscious and alert mechanisms. Now we're on to the big part, the cerebrum. This is the thing you think of when you think of the brain. And you can see it's divided into 5 lobes. Four. And you can kind of see the general functions of each lobe. The frontal is more of our thinking area. Parietal receives those sensory information. Occipital, vision, temporal, sound, and hearing. What I do want to bring to your attention a couple things. The divider between the 2 hemispheres is called the corpus callosum. And it's just a bunch of nerves that connect the right and left so that they can communicate together. In addition, you see all of these grooves and ridges. Let's see if I can get my pointer on one here. The raised portion, these wrinkles are called convolutions. And then the deep grooves in between those convolutions, those are called fissures. Okay. So that's basically our brain gross anatomy that we'll take a closer look at when we dissect the brain. Now we're going to go to the other component of the central nervous system, which is the spinal cord. The picture I have here is the very end of the spinal cord. It's pretty neat. It looks like the end of a horse's tail. So we actually call this portion of the spinal cord the cauda equina, which means horse's tail. And that's what it looks like down near the sacrum. Now what's really interesting about the spinal cord, we've learned a lot about it and the nerves that come out of the spinal cord based on some anesthesia and paralysis, unfortunately. But I do want to distinguish the two. Anesthesia is a temporary block. We can block nerve messages from going up to our brain temporarily, so it's just a loss of sensation. Whereas paralysis, if the spinal cord gets severed, complete loss of control. You don't have any signals going from your brain to that portion because the spinal cord isn't connected to deliver those messages out. And you can obviously see the different levels. If you're a C4 victim, if your 4th spinal cord gets severed in your cervical vertebrae, you're not going to be able to breathe on your own. Whereas if you go down here, if your spinal cord is severed near your lumbar region, you'll have control over everything in the upper part of your body except your legs. Okay, so anesthesia versus paralysis. But let's actually just take a look at the anatomy of the spinal cord. So the structure is such that it's about 2 feet in length, and the middle portion, I'll show you a picture on the next slide, but the middle portion is filled with this gray matter that kind of looks like a funky H. But it serves 2 purposes for us. It serves as our reflex center, which we'll talk about in just a bit, and it also is the conductor of nerve impulses to your brain. It gets all those messages and sends them up, and it receives messages from your brain and distributes them accordingly. So here's a look at the spinal cord cross-section. You can see the H in the middle, and that's the gray matter. That's where those messages are going to travel through. And there are lots of nerves going into our spinal cord. There's actually 31 pairs of nerves. Nerves are just a bundle of neurons, of nerve cells, all clumped together, all going towards the spinal cord. But there are 2 directions that can be traveled for nerve messages. The nerves or neurons that are going to the spinal cord delivering messages are called sensory neurons. Then there are going to be nerves that travel away from your brain called motor neurons. But in normal situations, the sensory neurons coming from all of your body are going to go through your spinal cord and deliver the message to your brain, here's what's happening. Your brain then is going to process that and figure out a way to respond and send that response to the motor neurons that can go out to your arms and your legs. And that's how things normally work in your central nervous system and how they communicate with every other part of your body. Now, if we're talking about a reflex, however, the reflex pathway is shorter. It goes up the sensory neuron, but then your spinal cord says, wait, this is an emergency. I can't waste my time sending that message up to the brain. I'm going to turn it around and give it my own response on the motor neuron so that your muscles can do what they need to do. And then I'll tell the brain, oh, hey, by the way, I did this. So your brain actually finds out after the fact when you pull your arm off or your hand off that burning stove, because that message doesn't get relayed. It goes straight to the spinal cord and back to the motor neuron to remove your hand. Now, covering your brain and your spinal cord are something called meninges. They're just really tough protective coverings. And there are 3 layers to the meninges. The outermost layer is called the dura mater. And so I have it labeled on the spinal cord and on the brain here. You can see this is the cerebrum portion. It's really, really tough. If you try and stretch that, you're not going to break it. Above that, or below that I should say, is the arachnoid layer. And we're going to talk about, there's a little bit of space in the arachnoid area. We're going to talk about that in just a bit. The innermost layer is called the pia mater. And so there's a little gap between the arachnoid and the pia. So let's zoom in on that on the next slide. But if you get any sort of infection in these maters, it's called meningitis because you're infecting the meninges. Now, back to that space between the arachnoid and the pia mater. That space is filled with fluid called cerebrospinal fluid, and it protects your brain and spinal cord, kind of gives it a little bath and nourishes it. In our brain, this is stored in areas, in addition to those meninges, in something called ventricles. Just open little areas. And in some people, those ventricles cannot be drained properly, so they start to swell. And you get something called hydrocephalus. There's a swelled ventricle filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And these individuals, like the picture below, have a really large head because they can't drain the cerebrospinal fluid. We've pretty much eradicated this now in the last 20 years. Because what we can do right after birth, we can put in a shunt that takes that cerebrospinal fluid into the abdomen to be filtered out, so that we don't have the cognitive effects of hydrocephalus, because those individuals will be severely disabled cognitively. Alright, we're just about finished. Now I just want to take things on a bigger scale. We looked at the central nervous system, but the central nervous system does no good if you have no nerves that it branches out from. And so now we're going to take a look at the peripheral nervous system, which is everything else. That's not your brain and spinal cord. There are nerves coming directly out of your brain. Those are called cranial nerves, and you have 12 pairs. Make sure you know that. They run directly from the brain to a particular organ. Do you have to know the actual names of these 12 spinal nerves? No, you don't, but they're here. So there's the optic nerve, the olfactory nerve, all of those. Go to your eye and go to your nose. There are also 31 pairs of spinal nerves, which do the same thing. They go from the spinal cord straight to organs. I have another picture of all those cranial and spinal nerves here, so you can see those. They just really help to do the work of the central nervous system, to send those messages out and to bring a response back in. So again, to reiterate, those nerves are sensory neurons if they're going to the central nervous system carrying that message, and they're motor neurons if they're carrying a message from the brain out to the other body parts. So that was a look at the central nervous system. And that really is the main foundation for our entire nervous system. It controls and communicates via electrical impulses so that we can respond to our environment and maintain homeostasis. So our central nervous system was just the brain and spinal cord. What we're going to start to get into, and we did today, was everything else. The peripheral nervous system. Now the peripheral nervous system is broken down into 2 subcategories. The somatic are things you consciously control, whereas the autonomic are things that are not under your conscious control. They're involuntary. And you can have two sub-branches of that. You can have parasympathetic and sympathetic. And in parasympathetic, this is called the rest and digest. This slows things down. This is what takes over when you're relaxed or after a big meal. On the other hand, the sympathetic nervous system, called the fight or flight, this is what kicks in before a sporting event or before a very stressful speech. So this is when it helps to speed up your nervous system. So make sure as you're looking and studying the nervous system that you really keep in mind, where does this particular instance fit in the hierarchy? And I hope you found this helpful.